All right. So today I'm going to be talking about the collapse, or I should say the so-called collapse of the Maya civilization. So to start out, I'm going to give a brief overview of the region, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Maya during the Classic period prior to its decline. So the Maya Empire is centered in the tropical lowlands of what is now Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula. So we see here on this map. Um, the lowlands were generally comprised of flat plains with low hills, escarpments, swampy areas, and a few lakes. We also see rainfall heavier in the lowlands than in the highlands. The highlands are generally fairly dry and they stay that way for most of the year. But we do see Maya sites widely dispersed, both between the lowlands and the highlands, though history tends to be dominated by the Maya lowlands. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on particularly the decline in the lowland region. So moving on, talking about Maya during the Classic period. So from about 250 CE to 900 CE is really considered the height of the empire. And it's characterized by several great accomplishments. Firstly, we see monumental architecture. So these sort of grand temple pyramids that you think of when you think of like Maya ruins. But we also see civic and ceremonial architecture. So ball courts, palaces, plazas, these commissioned works. Additionally, we see distinctive writing and calendric systems or timekeeping systems. Particularly, we see writing in the form of hieroglyphics on stelae, which are these sort of erected stone monuments. But we also see them on other architecture, such as building facades, staircases, lintels. And in addition to this, we see distinctive art and ceramics. Most notably, we see polychrome ceramics being used. So we really see complex social stratification during this time. And at the head of this hierarchy are the Maya kings, who would have served as divine shamans or intermediaries between the mortal and the supernatural. And these shaman kings would have ensured the cycles of renewal and time and maintained those. Additionally, we see these kings forming sort of dynastic legacies and really emphasizing their rule and making sure that they're remembered through artwork and sculpture and things of that nature. And underlying all of this, we have the farmer artisan class that really supports this structure. Some major lowland Maya centers of note are Tikal and Calakmul, who were rivals. But generally, we see a picture of a great early civilization that's culturally rich and really has this complex social structure at its height. Moving on, talking about the Terminal Classic period, we see from 600 to 800 CE, the peak of Maya kingship, and we see these elaborate social worlds of the elite and the ruling class. And underlying that, we see the Maya common class, who were made up of artisans, specialists, but most importantly, most of them were farmers. And we see them supporting this elite structure. Towards the end of the late Classic, though, we do witness a decline and an abandonment in many of the sites, and this is really what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. Traditionally, the terminal Classic period is referred to as a period of decline for the Maya, and most notably is this breakdown of divine kingship that I mentioned earlier, the sort of shaman kings. We see that breaking down in the lowlands during this time period. Also, monumental construction and the erection of these stelae ends at many sites during this period. So what happened? How did this great civilization end up declining? All right. So I put collapse here in quotation marks because really this wasn't a collapse as we think of the term today. It wasn't a crumbling of society as they knew it. And the recent consensus is the Maya as a whole didn't collapse. Much of popular portrayal is really overblown and overly dramatic. Though many areas did experience profound change, it was more of a decline or a transition rather than a collapse as we would think of it. The timing and the causes of the collapse of the lowland sites vary regionally, and these changes don't happen very quickly. It really spans about 300 years. But why did this happen? So there are various factors, both environmental and sociopolitical, that I'm going to talk about next. So as I mentioned, there are a bunch of proposed causes that have been given. Some environmental factors that have been proposed are soil erosion, changes in soil fertility, climate change, drought, overpopulation, sustainability issues, earthquakes, hurricanes, ground slope change, volcanic activity, deforestation, disease, plague. There are a lot of them. But few scholars really think that these environmental factors were the sole cause. They may have played a factor, but we don't think that they were the sole cause of this decline. So, sociopolitical factors. Some proposed explanations for sociopolitical factors that might have contributed include class conflict, peasant revolt, warfare, competition with central Mexico, changes in trade routes, invasion with and without resettlement, and political and ideological issues. So I've listed a bunch. Which one was it? Well, there's not one answer. Multivariate models seem to be the way to go. And explanations can differ from region to region, as do the timing of their decline. So we really don't have an all-encompassing answer for why this decline occurred. But we do have some probable explanations that we can point to. Some scholars suggest that there are short-term proximate causes as well as long-term structural causes. So we know that environmental factors most likely played a role, but these factors seem to be dealt with more effectively in some regions rather than other regions. But the collapse of so many sites during this period suggests that this collapse was regional rather than local. So perhaps environmental factors maybe set off a chain of events. So for instance, a drought or a famine could have set off a chain of socio-political events. Leaders trying to deal with these environmental factors and being unable to, which really would have eroded the trust in the leadership. But like I mentioned before, this wasn't a complete collapse, and millions of Maya people are alive today. So to say the civilization collapse is a bit misleading, as descendants of the civilization, as these descendants are from a civilization that transformed rather than declined. And here are my sources.